Jason Sullivan from the Rathbone group, and this week on Subrogation we are talking about livestock laws, or what you may be referring to as open range states. It's not about dog bites and it's not about strict liability for wild animals. This is about horses, cows, and donkeys. Before I get started, let me say that this is not legal advice. The laws regarding livestock laws vary between all the different states and within counties in those states, so it is impossible to give you legal advice that will answer the particular circumstance you may be facing. But this is to help you out with your approach on those circumstances as they come up. So what kind of circumstances are we talking about? Let's say you're a subrogation adjuster. A file comes to your desk. You have a total loss on a vehicle. Major injury to the driver, maybe to the passengers too, and then you see 3 words: car hit cow. That's all it takes. And you wonder, somebody has to be responsible for this. Who just has animals running around on the roads? They caused damage, they caused injuries, somebody has to be responsible. And so the first place you're going to look is say, what kind of state are we dealing with? And there are 2 kinds of states. The first state is open range law state. And the second, as you might guess, is the closed range law state. Open range law states are those that there is no duty on a livestock owner to confine their animal. And that's generally speaking. There are different laws regarding different types of animals in each state, but the general rule is in an open range state there's no duty to confine your animal. So if a farmer has a cow on the road and your car hits it, it's not his fault. There are limitations to this, obviously. The first limitation you might see a lot are with major state highways and federal interstates. If you drive around on any of these states, and you may be saying, I live in an open range state and I never see any animals. Well, that's a good thing, and that's probably because you're on the major highways or road systems or inside the cities where open range has been modified or changed. The second is that a lot of states adopt specific laws that limit portions of the state so that they are no longer open range. Texas, for instance, has 254 counties. Less than 10% of these counties are pure open-range states. And that's because most of the counties have adopted, in part, stock laws. And these laws are when a county gets together and votes, they can decide that a portion of the county or all of the county is no longer going to be open range. Or there'll be a limitation, certain times of year, certain times of livestock. Those animals must be confined. And so it changes from an open-range state to a closed range or a stock law county. Other western states have what they call herd districts. And again, it's the same idea. A state is an open range state with no duty to confine your animal. And then they make a herd district, and within that district, then animal owners do have a duty to confine their animals, and then they can have liability or negligence against them if they fail to do so. So then let's look at the other side. Closed range states. And this is a lot more on the East Coast and in the Great Plains. And in these states, they changed the common law that said there's no duty to confine. And they said, you cannot let your animals run wild. And so Kansas has a great example of that. Statute 47-122 just simply states it's unlawful for livestock to run at large. That's a very common type of statute that changes the law in the state from what would be open range to a closed range state. But Kansas does have laws that are very similar to other states. And so you're thinking, well, if there's a cow on the road, somebody must be at fault. And that's not actually how it works. So just because there's a cow on the road doesn't mean that the owner is liable. That would be strict liability. And Kansas and many other closed-range states do not adopt strict liability. Rather, there has to be negligence. Another common theory you might hear of is res ipsa loquitur. That means the thing speaks for itself in Latin. And basically what that means is that there's a presumption that if there's a cow on the road, the owner must have done something wrong and therefore they should be held liable. Again, Kansas and many other states do not adopt this theory. Instead, we're left with just general negligence standards. So, under a negligence standard, what is it that you have to prove? You have to prove that the owner failed to use reasonable care. They didn't act as a reasonably prudent person would under those same circumstances. And this can be highly fact-intensive. And so the things that we're going to look at are, what type of animal is it? Certainly if it is a cow or a steer that weighs upwards of 1,000 pounds versus sheep that might be much smaller, there's going to be a different standard for that owner in confining those animals in a closed range area. The other is, what is the nature of the animal? So if you have stallions with temperament that they are not broken and are trying to escape and run wild, versus maybe older horses that are docile and maybe have been used in other areas, are trained or at least domesticated in a sense, the duty on the owner is going to be different based on that type of animal or even the temperament of the animal. The key thing will be, did the owner know anything about it? You imagine you cart 1,000 steer across the country and then you let them loose. They're probably not going to be very happy. So the type of fencing or confinement that an owner might need in that scenario is going to maybe be different than cows that they've raised on the farm and are used to that environment and are for the most part generally docile. That does lead us to what type of fencing is involved. Is it simply posts and 2 barbed wire? Do you need steel reinforced fencing? The gates, how strong is the lock? How should the lock work? Will a simple pin work, or do you need padlocks? Greater things like that. Those are all fact situations that depends on the type of animal, the type of location, temperament of the animal. Is that fence necessary? And in some cases, you actually may need an animal expert to tell you what is customary or what would be required for that rancher or farm owner to be reasonably prudent in that situation. This fence, it doesn't look like much, but it's probably electrified. Having a picture of a fence like this would be really crucial to knowing the strength of your case. On the other hand, this fence looks pretty sturdy. If you knew from the outset that this was the type of fence a farmer used, and the animals were as active as the animals in this picture, you might know that your case wasn't that strong from the outset. The other thing is, how often are there fencing, is it checked? Obviously, when things are built, they degrade over time. So a fence that may be adequate maybe 10, 20 years ago may not be adequate now as there's overall deterioration. So how often did the farmer check his fencing and upgrade the fencing based on the needs of the animals that are in there? Another question to ask is, are there intervening forces? So you think, rancher owns it, he's responsible for the animals, he has the fence. What if there's a third party that comes by and opens up all the gates? That would be an intervening force. What if there's an unexpected storm with high winds that damages the fence in some way and allows the animals to escape? That's again an intervening forces. These are defenses that an animal owner or livestock owner may raise against your subrogation claim. Being aware of them at the outset to understand what other parties might be responsible. Maybe there's even a third party that you could pursue. If local high schoolers decide to go and open gates to go maybe cow tipping, those parties would be responsible. Maybe the owner is no longer responsible because he had no reason to know that somebody would open his gates. But once those gates have been opened, the party that opened those gates and failed to close them in a responsible manner could be liable for damages should that livestock escape, get on the road, and then cause a collision. Another thing to consider is whether or not the owner was on notice of the escape of the animals. If the owner's on notice, then in most states they have a general duty to go ahead and recapture those animals in a reasonably prudent manner. If the animals escape and the owner says, I don't have time, I have other things I have to do, and doesn't get to recapturing them for 2 weeks, that might be a situation in which that was negligent activity. If there's a storm in the night and an animal escapes and gets onto the roadway and it happens in the middle of the night, the owner has no idea because they put the animal in the barn before they went to bed, there's a storm, and then the next morning they find out there was a collision with that animal in a car, it's less likely that the owner would have had an opportunity to know of and then recapture that animal. Similar to that is whether or not there are prior circumstances. I'm sure you can imagine a circumstance where everybody in a community knows that guy can't keep his cows in his confinement. They're always escaping, they're always on the road, they're always having to call the sheriff's department to come and get the cows. If that's the case, then there is evidence that the owner maybe wasn't acting as a reasonably prudent person. If the cows are always escaping and he had knowledge of that, you would know that maybe some other action would be taken by a reasonably prudent person. So you can imagine with all of these facts that you need to know, if you live in the community, if your insured's in the community, it will be a great resource for you to get this information. But what if your insured's just passing through? Or you own a trucking company and this is not an area that you frequently go through? You may not have all this information. So undertaking the investigation, getting a copy of the police report, talking to neighbors, inspecting the condition of the fence as soon as you can after that loss can get you on that path to begin to gather the facts to determine whether or not was there any liability on this person, assuming we're in a closed range area. We see a lot of complex cases. Just one quick example of that for you. Just imagine an investor. They own land, but they never step foot on the land. They lease that land to a rancher who keeps some cattle on it. It's a big space. The rancher doesn't have that many cattle. So what does he do? He goes in ahead and invites other ranchers to bring their cattle. Maybe 5, 6, 7 other ranchers also keep their cattle on that land. Somehow, cattle get onto the roadway. First question is, whose cattle is it? Is it any one of those 6, 7, maybe 8 ranchers that keep cattle on that same plot of land? Second, who has responsibility for that fencing? Is it the ranchers whose cattle just happen to be there? Maybe they've never stepped foot on that land. Is it the rancher who is leasing the land and keeping his own cattle? What if he doesn't keep his own cattle there? Or the investor, the absentee owner? All of these things are potential complications for people to point the finger at other people, and really a good subrogation investigation will first start by identifying who might be potentially liable and then going from there. So to help you out with your checklist, when you get one of these cow or horse or donkey or sheep, any of these animals in the road versus your car that cause damages or injuries, provided a quick little checklist just for you to have. It's not extensive. It can't possibly cover all scenarios. And with any good investigation, these questions will lead to additional questions as you get information. But here's the list. Where did the loss occur? Was it an open range or closed range state? What type of animal was involved? Each state, whether it's open or closed range, a lot of the stock laws define certain animals that are excluded or included in certain times of year. Another thing to consider, who owned the land? Who owned the livestock? And importantly, how did the animal escape? When we're dealing with a regular negligence jurisdiction just like Kansas, knowing how the animal escaped is extremely important into understanding, could that loss have been prevented? Next, could a reasonably prudent owner have prevented the escape? Did the owner know of the escape? Did the owner know of other similar escapes? And again, all these things go to knowledge. There's a greater duty when someone knows there's a propensity for their animals to escape or that there is a history of them escaping. They knew they should have taken action, and if they failed to do so, many times they will be found liable. Then, would a reasonably prudent owner have been able to recapture these animals? And importantly for this, if the owner knows, if a prudent person would have been able to take action, reasonable action, to recapture those animals to avoid the loss, if they fail to do so, then under most states they can be found liable. And finally, always think about, are there any third parties that might be responsible? Whether it's a landowner who's not actually the one there in charge of the fencing, or whether it's a third party. My cow tipping scenario with high schoolers that go out onto the land and fail to shut a gate. Or let's say the owner was being reasonable. They decided to repair their fence. They hire a contractor to come out to make repairs, and that contractor fails to set up proper security or a temporary support system for that fence while they're working, and animals go ahead and escape while the repairs are going on. That also could be a negligence on the part of the contractor or on the livestock owner or landowner themselves. If you'd like a copy of this checklist, please email us at video@rathbonegroup.com. So I hope all of these scenarios and things to think about will help you on your way when you get these subrogation cases on your desk. Unfortunately, they do happen. They happen throughout the country in both open range and closed range areas. If you have any questions, feel free to send those on to us. If there's enough questions, we'll make another video, but we'd be happy to respond to anything you have specifically on a particular file or any other matter you might have in front of you. Thanks for watching this episode of On Subrogation. I'm Jason Sullivan, and that's the long and short of it.